The last 24 hours have been particularly interesting in terms of both events on the battlefronts in Ukraine, where, as I said, the main war that is being fought in the world today is playing out, and also in terms of diplomatic and political developments around the world. But I will start, as I traditionally do, with the developments on the ground in Ukraine, because we can still see a gathering acceleration of the Russian tempo. Now, what I've just said, I know is controversial with many people. They say that they look at the map, doesn't seem to them as if vast distances have been covered by the Russians. The advances still appear to be incremental, and perhaps unsurprisingly, in light of this, some people still cling to the hypothesis that we're in a kind of stalemate situation and that the Russians basically are not making much significant progress at all. Well, I beg to disagree. It seems to me that we now have a situation where every day we get reports that more important Ukrainian villages are falling under Russian control. And we've had, in fact, reports over the last 24 hours, confirmed by the Russian Defense Ministry, that at least 2 have done so. And we can see also the Russians gradually cutting off the Ukraine supply lines and creeping closer to the various important cities, towns in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass in particular, which Ukraine will find extremely difficult to defend once the hinterland around them, the villages and supply routes and all of those things, have been lost. But anyway, suffice to say that you don't just have to take it from me. I was very interested to see yesterday that Julian Rebke, German reporter of the battle, writing for the German tabloid newspaper Bild Zeitung, and one of the best informed reporters of the war, and also one, I should say, who is strongly pro-Ukrainian. Well, he actually said that the Ukrainian defences in Donbass are now in a condition of steady collapse, incremental collapse. Now, Rebke is unusual, in my experience, amongst Western reporters of the war, because not only does he follow it constantly and closely, but he seems to have a very clear grasp of the situation on the battlefronts. Other reporters of the war, of whom there are many, who write for the Western media, including, above all, the Anglo-American media, seem to me to have only sporadic contact with the situation on the battlefronts. They're probably not familiar with what is going on a daily basis, and that perhaps explains why they don't get that sense, that feeling about what is actually happening. Rebke is different. He, as I said, follows the developments in the war in minute detail, much as others in our community do. And that means that his opinion that, as I said, we're in a state of gradual, slow motion collapse of Ukrainian defences in Donbass, well, I think we can take that from him if you don't want to take it from me. Anyway, let's move on and discuss what is actually going on the battlefronts over the last 24 hours, as I'm familiar with it. Firstly, last night, the Russians conducted a major drone attack across Ukraine. Now, this did not involve missiles, and my impression is that the Russians carried out this attack partly in order to test new drone technology, along with the Geranium-2 drones, which are, as we all know, based upon Iranian designs. The Russians appear to have deployed for the first time in large numbers. Of course, we don't know how large, but in numbers at least. Another type of drone that apparently flies closer to the Earth than the Zherebets and is therefore perhaps more difficult to detect and can operate under cover of the various radar systems. Anyway, the Ukrainians claim that out of the 38 drones that attacked north-central Ukraine, including Kiev, 34 were shot down, which is, by the way, less than the 100% success rate that they often claim where drones are concerned. And I have no doubt at all that the bulk of the drones that the Russians launched were indeed shot down. But it does seem as if a significant number of drones did indeed get through, and there are reports that various energy facilities in northern Ukraine were hit, and there are apparently pictures of films of these facilities on fire. So it does look as if this new generation of subsonic drones, probably developed by the Russians themselves without Iranian input, have been reasonably effective on first use. We are likely to see more and more of them over the next few weeks and months as production of these drones in Russia ramps up. The Uranium-2 drones, I'm sure, will continue to be used by the Russians in very large quantities. Whilst I'm talking about things in the air, I might as well also say that there are reports which I find difficult to understand, and I'm not going to comment about in any detail, that the Russians have developed a new system of communications which in part uses balloons, various balloons. It's easy to imagine how that could be done. But anyway, apparently various balloons are floating around the battlefield and in the area around it, and they're a part of the Russian communication web, which is becoming more dense and complex and sophisticated all the time, even as the Russians seem to be increasingly successful in jamming Ukraine's communications and interfering with its Starlink system. Just saying. Anyway, that's reports about the drone attacks, the communication systems. What about the actual fighting on the actual battlefronts? Well, there's been a significant amount of important news from the Russians, and a Russian official has now, interestingly enough, specifically addressed the question of why the capture of the town of Krasnohorivka, southwest of Donetsk city, has taken as long as it has, given that the Russians appear to have captured all the main Ukrainian defensive positions in Krasnohorivka certain weeks ago. And this report comes from the official Russian news agency TASS. It says the following: the operation to liberate the town of Krasnohorivka, northwest of Donetsk, is almost complete, a deputy commander of Battle Group South's 5th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade said. The operation is nearing completion. The city is almost fully liberated, except for several streets, several houses. The officer said the operation is hampered by a large number of civilians who remain in the area. And I've heard this before, but I've never seen this actually positively confirmed. And in fact, I've somewhat discounted it. But there have been reports that Krasnohorivka, unlike some other towns, was never fully evacuated. And it wasn't just small groups of people who chose to remain, as has been true in Bakhmut and Avdiivka and other places, but in the case of Krasnohorivka, rather more. And This has complicated military operations, both on the part of the Ukrainians and, of course, also on the part of the Russians. Anyway, the latest maps of Krasnohorivka, which have been released by the various mapping projects, all show the same thing. The town almost completely under Russian control, including now, by the way, that park area to the north of the centre of Krasnohorivka. All of it now is being shown as being controlled by the Russians, as this deputy commander of the 5th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade of Russia's Battle Group South says. The Russians control all of Krasnohorivka except for several streets and several houses, in what, by the way, looks like a very thinly inhabited area. It looks as if we're talking about cottages rather than buildings, cottages surrounded by wooded areas and plants and vegetation. It's no longer the dense metropolitan area that we were hearing about. Anyway, that's the situation in Krasnohorivka. Further south, the news now, I think, is becoming much more alarming for the Ukrainians. And here I'm going to just say that I've had several people, but one person in particular, once again taking me to task for my inability to pronounce the name of the town that is spelt Vuhledar in English. That's, of course, its Ukrainian name. Its Russian name is Vuhledar. Anyway, I've been taken to task for my inability to pronounce the name of this town correctly. And I accept that it would be a lot easier to use the Russian name for the town, Vuhledar, rather than the Ukrainian, which apparently I'm mispronouncing. But I'm going to stick to calling it Vuhledar, and I'm going to give up the effort of trying to get an exact pronunciation of the name. I apologize for this, but it seems to me that if I was to start switching names for the place that I'm talking about at this point, it would only create confusion. It's not always easy to follow what is going on the battlefronts anyway, so I'm going to stick to calling it Vuhledar, with apologies to everyone in Ukraine who knows Ukrainian and who is probably either annoyed or amused by my inability to pronounce this place name correctly. Anyway, putting that aside, I've been discussing in recent programs that Russian forces have now established themselves along the road from Vuhledar to Konstantinovka further north. Konstantinovka, of course, itself, big village, defended by the 79th Brigade. This village, Konstantinovka, is itself, of course, under attack by the Russians. But anyway, the Russians have successfully established themselves along the road, the main supply road between Vuhledar and Konstantinovka. And as I discussed in my recent programs, it is quite clear to me from looking at the maps, is in fact the main supply road to Vuhledar. There are other roads. There is another road further to the west, but it appears to be a smaller road, and it doesn't actually enter. It's not a direct line into Vuhledar. It goes somewhat to the west of Vuhledar, and then there is a turning in that road, and it is that road, that turning, that must be used to supply the Ukrainian forces in Vuhledar. And by the way, that turning also seems to take place dangerously close to Russian positions further south, so it might be tricky to use. But I also said that if the Russians, having now cut the main supply road to Vuhledar, decide to advance beyond it, go on, cross the road, move westwards. The next supply road, the other supply road, is a relatively short distance away. The Russians would have to capture a village called Vodyane to reach it. There are other Ukrainian fortified positions in this area as well, which the Russians would need to clear. But if the Russians were able to do this, then both of the supply roads to Vuhledar would in effect be cut, and it would be very difficult for me to see how the town could be defended for any significant period of time without secure supplies. Well, over the last 24 hours, we're getting reports that the Russians have indeed crossed the road and that they are indeed advancing, presumably towards the village of Vodyane, and are attacking some of these fortified positions that the Ukrainians have established west of the road that the Russians have reached. So it looks as if the Russians are pursuing exactly the plan that I thought they might a couple of programs ago. Having cut the main supply road, they're continuing to advance westwards in order to cut the one remaining supply road leading to Vuhledar, which is still, at least to a certain extent, under Ukrainian control. Now, I don't know how long these battles are going to last. I don't know how well fortified these Ukrainian positions are. I get the sense, not very, actually. I get the sense overall that the Ukrainians are very short of manpower in this area, and that much of this manpower that they do have is not especially motivated. In which case, it is possible that the Battle of Vuhledar will end much more quickly than anybody expects, simply because, as I've said already, it looks as if all the supply roads to Vuhledar are going to be cut fairly soon, and there doesn't seem to be anything very much that the Ukrainians can do to prevent that. There was a very interesting discussion of this battle for these two roads in Redovka. I think it was yesterday. Redovka, Russian newspaper published in Smolensk, takes a strongly supportive position of the special military operation. It's the sort of newspaper that, covers the war, but obviously does it from a very pro-Russian point of view. But they do occasionally write interesting discussions on what is actually going on the battlefronts. And they're making a very interesting point about this fighting for these two roads leading into Vuhledar. They say that the number of troops that the Russians have in this area is not huge, that earlier in the war, the Ukrainians would have been able to scrape together enough men to conduct an effective counteroffensive and blocking operation. After a short time, after the Russians had made a few gains, we would get back into what is often called positional fighting, in other words, a stalemate, and that would be the general situation that would then continue probably for weeks and months until one side or the other, not usually the Russians, built up enough force to push further. What is happening now is that with the Ukrainians overstretched and overextended, with their forces severely depleted in terms of manpower, the Ukrainians simply do not have the reserves to be able to mount counterattacks and conduct blockade operations in the way that they did. And that means that the Russians can achieve breakthroughs or advances along the contact line, even when they use relatively small numbers of men. and that there is really no solution for Ukraine for this problem, because the solution lies in having many more troops on the contact line than Ukraine actually does. Anyway, this is an interesting analysis. It tells us a great deal about the effective aggressive attrition as conducted by the Russians for so many months, indeed years, in this conflict. It seems as if the Ukrainian forces are now so weakened that they can't parry even a relatively light attack by the Russians in a crucial area. And, well, we are seeing the same situation play out in the, I'm going to call it Pokrovsk area. This is the former area, which I used to formerly call the Avdiivka or Zherebets area, but as Dima at the Military Summary channel correctly said some days ago, it no longer makes much sense to talk about it as the Avdiivka or Zherebets area, because the Russians are now well beyond those two places, and they're now starting to approach the important town, 50,000 people before the war, of Pokrovsk, and the other key supply towns like Selidovo, Mirnograd, and the others. And I've been saying, I discussed in several programs recently, how the Russians appear either to have captured all or most of Progress. We don't have, as of today, any full clarification of the exact position there. But anyway, it does seem that the Russians, it is indisputable that the Russians control a significant part of Progress, and perhaps all of it. And again, yesterday, reports came that the Russians have actually trapped several dozen or score of Ukrainian troops immediately to the north of Progress. And it's not yet clear how those troops can withdraw or whether they even can. By the way, Julian Repke, who I mentioned earlier in this program, the German journalist for Bild Zeitung, he says that Progress is 22 kilometers distant from Pokrovsk, which is certainly within artillery range, or at least long-range artillery range, for the Russian military. If they station their new artillery system, the Malva, for example, which is a new wheeled artillery system which has just been relatively recently deployed to the battlefronts. That is well within the distance in which it can fire on a position if the system is deployed in Progress. The Russians can indeed begin to shell Pokrovsk if they choose to do so. Whether they will, of course, is an entirely different matter. They could launch rocket attacks using multiple launch rocket systems. They have that means to do that and have long done so. And of course, they can also bomb Pokrovsk using their air force. But anyway, the point is that the Russians are now getting very close to Pokrovsk, and it's difficult to doubt that this is, in fact, a Russian objective. The other big battle that's taking place in central Donbass is for the Toretsk conurbation. And here again, we're getting reports that the Russians are continuing to make further progress. They appear to have captured, as I said yesterday, a coal mine area in the Toretsk area, coal mines and their various industrial facilities that make up coal mines, and of course the waste heaps are natural fortified positions that the Ukrainians have made effective use of, at various points in this war. Anyway, the Russians seem to have captured one of these coal mines yesterday. And this morning, it's been reported that they've captured an area of high-rise buildings in Toretsk itself. And this would have been one of the major, presumably one of the major fortified positions inside Toretsk. The town and the outlying villages and settlements around it are under round-the-clock bombing by the Russian Air Force. Bombing in this area is incredibly intense, using the various FAB bombs, though not yet, as far as I know, the FAB 3000s. But the town is being very heavily bombed, and I suspect this is one of the factors which is making it very difficult, perhaps even impossible, for the Ukrainians to mount an effective defence in the area. But the London Times, reporting from the general area of Toretsk 2 days ago, said that Ukrainian officers were complaining to the Times that the major problem that the Ukrainians face in Toretsk, as elsewhere on the battlefronts, is that the Russians are too many and that they themselves are heavily outgunned, that the Russian artillery and aviation forces are basically overwhelmingly strong. Now, we've had less news over the last couple of hours from Chasiv Yar, but what news we do have suggests that the paratroopers of Russia's 98th Airborne Brigade have not only reached the central part of Chasiv Yar, but that they're now busy clearing the northwestern parts of Chasiv Yar as well. And that Chasiv Yar is under attack from multiple directions, and that the bombing of Chasiv Yar is also very intense. And though the Ukrainians are doing everything they can to hold the Russians back in Chasiv Yar, the operation is proving, the defense is proving unsuccessful. Again, one has to ask whether perhaps the Ukrainians are over-investing in the defense of Chasiv Yar, whether it might have made more sense to pull back to more defendable positions closer to Krasnohorivka, maybe. Who knows? It's been suggested many times that this isn't really a practical option because of Chasiv Yar being located on higher ground means that any positions the Ukrainians fall back to west of Chasiv Yar would be overlooked by the Russians once they secure control of Chasiv Yar. But whatever, fighting for Chasiv Yar is underway. It is extremely intense. I don't think there's any serious doubt about what the outcome is going to be. The Ukrainians experiencing very heavy losses, trying to defend Chasiv Yar, but to no avail. The Russians gradually expanding their territory, the territory they control in Chasiv Yar. Now, the most dramatic news over the last 24 hours has come north of Chasiv Yar in the Kupiansk direction, where the Russians claim that they have captured, well, not the Russians, the Russian Defense Ministry says that the Russians have now captured 2 important villages. And the report from the Russian Defense Ministry, as usual, is very brief. The Zapad, that's to say the West group of forces, liberated Rozovka, which is actually technically in Lugansk region, and Peshanoye Nizhny, which is in Kharkiv region, as a result of successful actions and captured more advantageous lines and positions. Now, the key point to understand about this is that these two villages bring the Russians significantly closer to the Oskol River. And a little further to the south, as I understand, we now have reports that the Russians have not only cleared completely all of the village of Makeyevka east of the Zherebets River. This is a river that seems to interconnect with the Oskol River. So they form a kind of continuous line. Anyway, the Russians have not only cleared all of Makeyevka east of the Zherebets River, but that they have crossed the river in Makeyevka, the Zherebets River in Makeyevka, and are now fighting on the west bank of Makeyevka in order to capture the whole of this village. Now, if this is correct, then the Russians hold a bridgehead west of the Zherebets River. And that would be important. It would be particularly important if the Russians are then able to push forward from these two other villages that they've just captured towards the Oskol River. It would mean that the town of Liman, which the Russians briefly controlled in the summer of 2022, was again within their reach. It would also put in jeopardy Ukrainian positions further north in Kupiansk, which is presumably the underlying objective. And we haven't had so much news over the last 24 hours from what's going on in Siversk, in the area around Siversk, a little to the east. But it does look as if the Russians, as I've discussed already, are closing their ring around this village and, of course, around this small town. Of course, if Siversk, all of these other places fall, if the Russians cross the Zherebets and Oskol rivers, if they retake Kupiansk and Liman, well, the entire gains of Ukraine's Kharkiv 2022 counteroffensive would be reversed, which would be incredibly embarrassing. But more importantly, the Russians will have taken Slavyansk into a semicircle, northern spur of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, even as the Russians are now closing in on Kramatorsk further south in the area of Chasiv Yar. So, again, going back to my earlier point about the fact that the Russian advances may look incremental, they are nonetheless of a very important nature. We can start to see how the Russians are capturing more squares on the checkerboard and coming closer to that point where the two towns of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk in northern Donbass and Pokrovsk and Mirnograd in southern Donbass in central Donbass will find themselves under attack without any hinterland of fortifications and villages to cover them. And as I've said already, past experience shows that when the Russians do manage to break into a town, are able to penetrate the defences, then at that point, it's basically game over. The town in question is certain sooner or later to fall. Anyway, there we are. So, interesting news from there. If one goes further north still to Kharkiv region, as I've said already many times, the major battle there is the one that's taking place in Vovchansk. We have very little news about what exactly is taking place in Vovchansk. Group of forces north are giving us very elliptical reports about the fighting, but they seem to be laying particular stress on the fact that they've not only crossed the Volga River within Vovchansk itself and are now fighting for areas of southern Vovchansk, but that they've achieved this bridgehead to the east of the Seversky Donetsk River, which they have been steadily enlarging. Now, this is a perfect example of how confusing the situation in Vovchansk actually is, because nobody seems to know for sure exactly where this Russian bridgehead east of the Seversky Donetsk River is actually located. There's been an enormous amount of debate and argument about this. Group of forces north has mentioned a village called Bugrovata, which is in the vicinity of this bridgehead, but that in itself is not sufficient to explain precisely where this bridgehead is. And there's lots of arguments amongst mappers as to where precisely this particular bridgehead is located. But whatever, the point about the bridgehead is not perhaps its exact location, but the fact that it appears to be a dagger pointing at the supply lines of the Ukrainian forces in Vovchansk, and with the Russians gradually pushing the Ukrainians out of northern Vovchansk, north of the Volga River, capturing more areas of Vovchansk north of the Volga River, pressing their advantage south of the Volga River in southern Vovchansk. The Russians look to be positioning themselves to conduct some kind of an offensive at some point over the next few weeks, presumably when Ukrainian forces have been reduced still more, aimed again at cutting off Ukrainian supply lines to Vovchansk, to their group of forces in Vovchansk. So, an important day in terms of the fighting in Ukraine. A critical situation for the Ukrainians in three places: in the area of the road between Vuhledar and Konstantinovka, with all the indications being that Vuhledar's existence as a key fortified position under the control of the Ukrainian army, that this period in the existence of this town is coming to an end, that it will soon be encircled, and more likely than not that the Ukrainians will withdraw. Further evidence that the Russians are now closing in on the important town of Pokrovsk, and that they're capturing more villages in the area, and that Ukrainian resistance in this area is weak and unable to stabilize the situation, to hold back the Russians, and a critical situation for the Ukrainians, both in Chasiv and further north in the Kupiansk area, where the Russians are gradually preparing not just to capture Seversk and recapture Liman and Kupiansk, but are perhaps aiming in time to encircle Slavyansk from the north, even as Russian forces push from the south, from Chasiv Yar. And a real possibility, more and more commentators are now talking about this. I noticed that Simplicius the Thinker was discussing it in one of his recent pieces. A real possibility that a genuine cauldron might emerge, that Ukrainian troops fighting in the Toretsk area could become encircled if these Russian advances in the Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar areas continue, and if the supply lines are indeed cut. As I've said before, the Russians gradually positioning their pieces for what in terms of the battle for Donbass, they clearly envisage as a series of checkmate moves. Anyway, that's the situation on the battlefronts. Donald Trump and Vladimir Zelensky had a telephone call yesterday. And Trump says that it was an excellent call, all went really well. Zelensky has given a far more guarded response. He appears to say that whatever the Americans do, Ukraine is determined to fight on and is not prepared to moderate in any way its objectives, its maximalist objectives, to return all of Ukrainian territory, all of the territory that Ukraine possessed when it gained its independence in 1991, all of this territory, bring it back under Ukrainian control. So, a telephone conversation between Trump and Zelensky, which, so far as I can see, has achieved nothing and changed nothing. Now, Zelensky's most fervid supporter in the West, Boris Johnson, the former British Prime Minister, has now written a lengthy piece in the Daily Mail. It seems to me connected in some respects to Zelensky's call to Trump. And I'm not sure whether Johnson is addressing Trump or Zelensky, or perhaps both, but one can start to see perhaps the kind of ideas that are floating around and circulating at the present time in the minds of several of the people who are looking to end this war and to influence perhaps Donald Trump. And Boris Johnson has now rather grudgingly admitted that Ukraine is not going to be able to recapture all the territory that it used to have when it became independent in 1991, and that it will have to compromise in terms of territory. But he still seems to think that the Russians can be persuaded to disgorge all the territory that they have acquired since the start of the special military operation, withdraw back to the February 2022 front lines, give up places, in other words, like Mariupol and Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, return all of those to the Ukrainians, and that Ukraine, having accepted the temporary loss of Crimea and the pre-2022 territories of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic, it can nonetheless then enter NATO, and Boris Johnson floats a fantastic plan that the rebuilt and rearmed and re-equipped Ukrainian army can then replace the United States, the US military, as Europe's shield against future Russian aggression. And I wonder whether this is the plan that Boris Johnson has tried to sell to Trump. He's been to the United States and has met Trump, and whether Zelensky and Johnson might be working together, perhaps just possibly, to try to sell Trump with this idea. Well, I can imagine it, especially coming from Johnson. But I think, again, it's important to say that from a Russian point of view, this is a complete non-starter. Putting aside the fact that I don't think that Putin would in any way agree to return territory captured since February 2022 to Ukrainian control. There is, of course, a provision in Russia's constitution that precludes that. I can't imagine that Putin would agree to do anything of that kind. I have to also say that the idea that having returned all this territory to Ukraine, Ukraine would then be at liberty to join NATO, rearm and re-equip itself to the extent that Boris Johnson says, to the point where it actually replaces the US military as a major force in Europe, in NATO. Well, putting aside the fantastic character of that whole idea, any proposal on those lines is obviously going to be completely unacceptable to the Russians. I know that there are some who say that the Russians should actually welcome Ukraine's adhesion into NATO, that Ukraine, to all intents and purposes, is now a de facto member of NATO. It'd be easier to control. What the Russians should aim for is both territory and concrete cast iron guarantees that there would be no build-up of NATO forces against them in a NATO Ukraine. It's important to stress that the Russians have already rejected that proposal out of hand, and I don't believe that they will ever revisit it. Putin made it completely clear in his address a few weeks ago to the Russian Foreign Ministry Board, and he's made it clear also in various public statements and interviews that for the Russians, Ukraine's entry into NATO remains an absolute red line. And I don't expect Putin or anyone else in Moscow to change that. Briefly and straightforwardly, I think that if Putin were to retreat from that position after having made NATO the big issue for the war, well, that would be an incredibly difficult sell with most of the Russian public, especially that part of the Russian public that has supported the war. In fact, I expect they would be furious with him. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly still, I think that whatever agreements were reached between the Russians and the West to limit NATO's presence inside a Ukraine that is a member of NATO, whatever agreements were reached, I don't think the Russians would believe that the Western powers would ever honour them. I think they would be sure, in fact, that the Western powers at some point, in some way, would break them. And I think that the Russians not only don't trust the West to honour any such promises, but are determined to resolve this question of Ukraine and the security challenge which they believe it poses once and for all, and that this is their main objective now in this war. On the question of broken promises by NATO, I must add, by the way, that I think if that is what they feel, and Putin has repeatedly said that they do, I think that if that is the case, then they have some, in fact, very strong historical grounds to think in that way. I can remember, for example, back in the 1990s, at a time when the Russians, through gritted teeth, had been pushed into agreeing to NATO's eastward expansion into the territory of the former Warsaw Pact, that the Russians were given repeated promises that there would be no Western infrastructure, military infrastructure established in Eastern Europe, that there would be no military bases there, Western military bases there, that NATO would convert itself from a military alliance into a more political association of states. The Russians remember all of this, and they are perfectly well aware of how it all ended, and they're not going to go there again. And of course, when they listen to people like Jens Stoltenberg and others, and Stoltenberg, I believe, is still, as of the time of making this program, NATO Secretary General. Anyway, when they listen to the way people talk and the way governments in Germany and Britain and other places talk, not to mention the Baltic states, I think that on these issues they will be unyielding. Now, I hope that this is being explained by others to Donald Trump, and that if he does indeed decide that he wants to negotiate with Putin, that he understands that there are certain things that Putin is not going to concede. He is not going to concede Ukraine's NATO membership. He will be very loath to agree to a ceasefire, as he's made clear, until there is a final agreement. He does want to see the Ukrainian forces withdraw completely from the 4 regions. Probably he will be prepared to negotiate on other matters, but I think that these are core conditions that by this stage in the war, the Russians are not going to want to compromise about. Previously, we were talking about 2 years ago. Well, it would have been different. But the situation has changed radically since then. The Russians have cranked up their forces. They've advanced westwards. They are winning the war. They've obviously also suffered significant losses. I don't think they're in any mood to compromise on these core questions. Not anymore. Just saying. Now, having said that, I noticed that Rick Grenell, who, along with Eldridge Colby, is being widely spoken about as a future figure within Donald Trump's foreign policy and national security team. Anyway, Rick Grenell has been making comments to European officials, telling them that as far as the United States is concerned, or at least as far as the Trump-led United States of the near future is concerned, Ukraine is primarily Europe's problem. It is the Europeans who need to sort it out. It is the Europeans who need to get together and decide how exactly they're going to resolve this problem for themselves. It is not a problem that the United States wants to get too deeply involved in. That, it seems to me, is the theme that's now coming from the Trump team, from J.D. Vance, from Eldridge Colby, from Rick Grenell. And I think that that isn't going to change. The Americans will listen, and might even float from time to time ideas of their own about how the problem in Ukraine should be sorted out. But they've decided, this is all of course assuming that it is the Trump team that is elected in November, they've decided that they're not going to get drawn into the details, that it will be left, they're going to leave it to the Europeans, to the British and the Germans and the French and the European Commission to work it all out with the Russians. Now, I have to say straightforwardly that I don't think that the Europeans are remotely capable of working this thing out. There was a summit meeting at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire in Britain. Keir Starmer invited all the major European leaders there. Vladimir Zelensky was there. This is before he attended the meeting of the British cabinet, making him, by the way, the first leader of a foreign country to do so since Tony Blair invited Bill Clinton to attend a British cabinet meeting in 1997. And that, by the way, was, I think, the first time a thing like that had ever happened. Anyway, the European leaders all met at Blenheim Palace, and it was absolutely obvious to me that they weren't able to agree on anything very much, certainly not anything about concerning Ukraine. Some European leaders, the European Commission in particular, which continues to be led by Ursula von der Leyen. She has just been re-elected European Commission President. I was sure she would be, by the way. Anyway, the European Commission, as far as I can see, remains as hawkish as ever, as does the NATO bureaucracy. They are in no mood to compromise with the Russians. I don't believe that the current German government is in any condition or mood to negotiate with the Russians either. A future German government might take a different line, but not this one. In France, the situation is so unstable and so chaotic that I cannot see how any French government at the present time is in any position to negotiate seriously about anything. As of the time of making this program, President Macron has accepted the resignation of his Prime Minister, Gabriel Attal, and as far as I'm aware, there is no new French government in place to take the place of the outgoing Attal government. And to the extent that Attal remains in place, fulfilling a provisional role, he can only provide limited support to an increasingly isolated and embattled President, Emmanuel Macron. And as for European support for Ukraine, well, I discussed recently, and about 2 programs ago, that Germany is halving the assistance military assistance it's going to provide to Ukraine next year because of a festering budget crisis in Germany, and none of the other countries in Europe are really in any kind of position to make up the difference. Now, recently, over the last couple of programs, I've discussed some fascinating revelations that we've had from the Western media about the state of shell production in first Europe and then the United States. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty published a long piece which said that the European objective of producing 1.7 million 155mm shells by the end of this year is a fantasy. Europe will be lucky if it is able to produce between 500,000 and 600,000 shells. In other words, a third, less than a third, of the targeted number. And of course, President Pavel's brilliant plan of buying 800,000 shells on the international arms market has proved an expensive flop, just as on the Duran we said that it would. And yesterday I discussed at length an article in Reuters which confirmed that which Brian Beletic and I myself and us on the Duran and others, many others, Scott Ritter, all sorts of others, have been saying for a very, very long time, which is that American production figures for shells are also going to disappoint. That the United States' shell production system is run down and badly managed and in need of prolonged reorganization and investment, and that the target to produce 100,000 155mm shells by the end of 2026 is almost certainly overambitious and unachievable, and that the actual number of shells that the United States is currently producing at 36,000 a month is probably the most that can be achieved for the remainder of this year, and I would not be surprised actually for much of next year as well. By the way, just to say, with supply bottlenecks, problems with workers in an old factory working with old machines, problems of disorganized work patterns and all the rest, it might be difficult to sustain a production rate of 36,000 rounds of artillery shells a month. I didn't discuss that in the program yesterday, but let's just assume that they will continue to keep up that level of production and that this isn't just a flash in the pan achievement. We'll just have to wait and see. Anyway, today, Reuters, following up on the crisis in production, is discussing the situation with production of Patriot air defense missile interceptors. And again, the situation there is very bad. Now, Brian Beletic has been discussing the question of production of Patriot air defense interceptors in many, many programs. And he's pointed out that the production rates before the war started was around 500 missile interceptors a year, which comes nowhere close to meeting Ukraine's needs, and that the number of Patriot air defense missiles globally is in short supply, and that perhaps the United States has increased production to 600 interceptors a year by this time, but that's not going to be anywhere near enough either. Well, Reuters has confirmed everything that Brian Beletic has been saying, and it's done so in a rather interesting, rather roundabout way, because it's not actually talking about production of air defense interceptors in the United States. It is talking about production of air defense, Patriot air defense interceptors in Japan. Now, the reason this is so is because Japan already has a production line producing air defense, Patriot air defense missile interceptors, missiles. Around 30 a year, to be precise, which, in terms of what is happening in Ukraine, is a dismal number. There were plans to double this figure to something like 60 a year, which again scarcely seems that many. But that whole plan has basically failed because the United States is not producing enough missile seekers. And we're told that the problem with the missile seekers, presumably the guidance systems of these missiles, is that though there is a plan to increase that production by around 30%, so far it is not proving possible to do so. And the result is that there is a logjam. In fact, we're told that it could take several years before MHI, this is the company that's responsible for producing this vital component, several years before MHI is able to raise output. This is the Japanese company that produces the interceptors. It takes several years before MHI is able to raise output because of the shortage of these missile seekers. So there we are. It looks as if this critical component, which actually provided by Boeing, I'm sorry, I hope there isn't a confusion, it is Boeing that is providing the Seekers, it is MHI, Mitsubishi Heavy Industry, which in Japan is producing the 30 missiles, but it cannot produce more than 30 missiles because Boeing is not providing it with enough Seekers to do so. And we are now told in this article, that though the plan remains to increase total production of Patriot missile interceptors from about 500 a year to more than 700 per year globally as soon as possible, the objective now, the plan, is to produce 650 Patriot missile interceptors globally by 2027. In fact, there is a sentence in this article which says that Lockheed Martin, that's the overall producer of the Patriot missiles, has said it is increasing its output of Patriot interceptors from 500 to 650 by 2027, which rather suggests that the actual production today is still 500 rather than the 600, which Brian Beletic, and by the way, I myself, rather optimistically imagined that it might be. And we also go on to read that Boeing last year began expanding its Seeker factory in the United States to increase production by 30%, although the additional lines won't operate until 2027. And Boeing is refusing to say how many Seekers it actually produced last year. So, just as shell production is encountering a whole set of bottlenecks, it turns out the same is true of Patriot missile production as well. Now, I get to say something. I still am a little bewildered that the United States is, and indeed Ukraine, are so focused on the Patriot missile, Patriot system. We are talking about a huge, complex, very expensive system. Always production of it is going to be relatively limited. And we've seen anyway in Ukraine that the Patriot cannot defeat Russian hypersonic weapons. And moreover, it is intensely vulnerable to Russian attacks. The Russians, for the record, claimed yesterday that they destroyed 2 more Patriot missile batteries in Ukraine. Perhaps they have. The claim came from the Russian Ministry of Defense. I personally think they did. Russia has a vast air defense system. And the core of that system, the missiles that we all hear about, know about so much as the S-400s and the S-300s, which are comparable in size and sophistication to the Patriots, though perhaps, to say it frankly, rather more effective. But the Russian air defense system is much more complicated than just those missiles. Alongside the S-300s and the S-400s, the Russians have a huge variety of other much cheaper, much smaller systems. The Buk air defense systems, the Tor air defense systems, the Pantsirs, the S-350s. They have all kinds of other systems. For example, to shoot down drones, they use the Strela 10 air defense system, which was actually first developed in the 1970s, though it has been updated since then, but it's effective in shooting down drones. It seems to me if there was any real intention to assist Ukraine, developing cheaper, simpler air defense systems, investing money in those would be a better investment than going on and investing all this money in Patriot systems, which, as I said, are proving of limited actual use on the battlefronts. Not only are the Russians destroying them, but as I discussed in my program yesterday, they are successfully shooting them down. Anyway, Zelensky is obsessed with the Patriot missile system. So it seems are his supporters in the West. That is the system he is going to get. He's also, of course, getting large numbers of Hawk air defense missile systems. Somebody recently suggested to me that, in fact, the Hawk might actually have some use in the sense that it can shoot down some of these drones that the Russians are sending over the Ukrainian skies. Perhaps the Hawks are being used for that. But this is not a mobile system in the way that all the Russian systems that I described are. And I would have thought that the Hawks, if they were used in that way, would be easy to maneuver around and, of course, to destroy if the Russians were prepared to waste advanced missiles to destroy obsolete Ukrainian ones. Anyway, there we are. So, massive supply bottlenecks in every sphere, in shell production, in air defense missile production. I come back to this question. Why would Vladimir Putin, who knows all of this, why would the Russians, who are familiar with this whole situation, who are aware that their army is advancing successfully on the battlefronts, be prepared to make the kind of concessions that Boris Johnson was offering them, was demanding from them in return for peace? I just don't see it. I mean, it doesn't make any sort of sense. And certainly expecting that the Europeans can take the place of the United States and supply Ukraine with the sophisticated weapons it needs in the sort of quantities that Ukraine also demands, when the mighty United States is not succeeding. I think that is a fantastic idea as well. The political situation in the United States remains incredibly fluid. Joe Biden continues to cling on to office, and he still wants to remain the Democratic Party's nominee for the presidency in November. The Democratic Party, or at least some of its key figures, Barack Obama, Nancy Pelosi, they're trying to oust him. They're trying to get him to stand down, and there are now all kinds of complicated plans for getting the delegates appointed through the primaries who are supposed to be voting to nominate Biden at the forthcoming convention to break from him and to support someone else who would probably be Kamala Harris, though even that so far does not appear to have been agreed. Anyway, all of that, as I said, is going on in the United States. This chaos and confusion in the Democratic Party inevitably is strengthening the view which I now tend to share, that Donald Trump, though he's not a shoo-in for the presidency in November, is becoming increasingly likely to win. The Americans, if Trump does win, are likely to wash their hands of the whole Ukraine affair. As far as the Americans are concerned, this has been a complete debacle. Trump and Vance and Grenell and Colby are saying that for the United States, with its China and the Pacific, is a much more urgent priority at this time. American resources are finite, and besides, Ukraine is not a core interest of the United States. This has been a Democrats' war, and the Republicans, this particular set of Republicans, have no interest in it and are prepared to wash their hands of it. Given the intractable problems of supporting Ukraine, given the fact that for the Europeans doing so without the United States is inconceivable, surely the moment has therefore come for the Europeans to capitalise on what Viktor Orban has done and to start opening up communications with the Russians. This is exactly what Orban has now suggested. The Ukrainians are furious with him. They've just shut the pipeline that supplied oil from Russia to Hungary and Slovakia in retaliation. That will cause oil and fuel shortages in Hungary. The Hungarians will find a workaround, probably by importing oil via Turkey and Serbia. Just saying, that's most likely what's going to happen. But the point I'm making is that Orban is right. This is the time when some kind of outreach by the Europeans to the Russians is essential. And it has to be done on a realistic basis, not these fantastical schemes that Boris Johnson, who bears a huge share of responsibility for this mess, is coming up with. Someone needs to go from Europe with some kind of plenipotentiary powers to Moscow to meet with Putin and to see whether some way forward over Ukraine and over the general security situation in Europe can be charted. Now, all kinds of names immediately present themselves. Orban himself, the Turkish government, which would be very keen to embrace this task, though perhaps it's not entirely to be relied upon, given that it has objectives of its own. In Germany, people like Gerhard Schröder, for example, but of course he is persona non grata now, not just for the German political class as a whole, but to his former party, the Social Democrats, which he led to victory in repeated elections, and which he led successfully as Chancellor. Just saying. But Gerhard Schröder would be an obvious choice, but again, he is ruled out. But there are others, people in Austria, for example, who could probably also fulfill this. Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, very still popular in Italy. She took a strong pro-Ukrainian line, which makes her presumably acceptable to the political class in Europe. But nonetheless, she has shown some degree of doubt about this whole affair, and other political figures in her government are much more outspoken about their growing skepticism about Project Ukraine. This ought to be the key thing to do at the next meeting of the European Council. It can't be Orban, which it should be, by the way. He is, after all, president of the European Council, and he's somebody who is on at least civil terms with Putin and also with many of the other leaders of the global south, well, the time has come to find someone else. Let me repeat again, I don't think that there is any physical danger to the whole of Europe coming from these developments in Ukraine. I don't believe that a Russian military victory in Ukraine and a Russian annexation of Ukraine, if that's what it comes to, the whole of Ukraine even, would reduce Europe's security to any significant extent. I don't get any sense that the Russians have any desire to expand their influence into Europe in that kind of way. People who think so are, I think, unaware of what an unhappy episode it was for the Russians themselves, being in Eastern Europe for all those decades after the end of the Second World War, finding that they were unwanted by the East Europeans and finding that the East European governments that they were supporting were endlessly needy and demanding and often ungrateful for whatever help the Soviets at that time were providing them. I don't think the Russians have any desire, any wish to repeat that all over again. But it will nonetheless be a major psychological and geopolitical defeat for the West, and for the Europeans especially, if there is a military victory, and a Russian military victory. And besides, as J.D. Vance, Rick Grenell, and others have pointed out, Europe anyway needs to think long and hard about its long-term relationship with Russia. So, agreeing some kind of new security treaty with the Russians, I would have thought, is a priority, and that, of course, ought to involve the United States, and, by the way, Ukraine, whatever is left of it, but it would benefit the Europeans too. Surely, now is the moment, before things in Ukraine become set in stone, before the Russians win, occupy all of Ukraine or most of Ukraine, establish their own government in Kiev, perhaps move towards further annexations as demanded by people like Dmitry Medvedev. Now is the time to carry out that reach out, to see what possible common ground with the Russians could be found in order not just to bring this war to an end, but to secure the peace of Europe. Will they do it? Of course not. They will do what they have been doing all along. They will follow where the hardliners amongst them have led them, and they will be furious and disappointed and dejected when the hardliners in the United States, gathered as they have been in the Biden administration, are voted out of power. At that point, the European leaders will become, well, the rabbit caught in the headlights of the oncoming car. Unable to move, unable to think, unable to shift, or to make any kind of decision, standing there as the great trundling force of the Russian army clankers towards them. It's going to be a smash, and, well, I suppose I'll have to be there to cover it. Well, thank you again for joining me today. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Please don't forget that you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can check out our shop where you can find all sorts of amazing things, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. Sorry, by the way, my voice has been slightly affected by heavy hay fever, something I suffer from very badly, but there it is. Anyway, thank you again. Speak to you soon. Have a very good day.